Welcome to the Hedgeneer Podcast with your hosts, Michael Watson and Jhanvi
And welcome back to another episode of the Hedgeneer Podcast. I'm your co-host, Michael Watson.
And I'm your other co-host, Jhanvi.
And this is the show where we talk about technology, data, and AI in the hedge fund and asset management industry. And we've started transitioning to a weekly show just to be able to keep up with the pace of AI, because it's almost every week that some major release changes the narrative. So I'm curious, Jhanvi, what's new over the course of the last week?
Yeah, I think that the weekly cadence has been a nice opportunity for us to keep up with what's going on in the world, but also kind of keep up with us. I feel like we're busier now than we've ever really been. I spent the day today on site with one of our newer clients, working with them to streamline some of their fundamental research workflows to help automate some of the kind of core parts of their research process around coverage initiation and model creation. And so that's been really interesting to see kind of in real time. So we went in for like a 30-minute meeting. It ended up being a 2-hour kind of session where members of their investment team kind of came in to see what we were working on. We showed them how we are essentially having an agent start building the first version of every research model that they would potentially need to build whenever they start covering a new name. And so that there's obviously a lot of nuances and a lot of complex moving pieces in making that work. And we've been working on it for quite some time, but we're at a stage where we had something to show them. And it was really exciting to see their reactions and see how excited they were to have something like this, because these are people that have spent their entire careers doing this. And so just them being able to see and immediately understand the value of what this is and how much time they're going to be able to save as a function of it. And this just being the beginning of the many things that we're going to do with this relatively new client was really exciting. So that was kind of like the highlight of my day. What about you?
Highlight of my day, I think one thing that we're doing with the University of Lehigh's Master in Financial Engineering program is sponsoring a evaluation matrix of every model using Claude Code and understanding if I were to swap out using the Claude Code agent SDK or like the Claude Code agentic harness for DeepSeek or for Gemini 3.5 Flash that just came out yesterday, or Sonnet versus Haiku versus Opus, how much does the quality degrade? How much does the cost increase or decrease? And what is the wall time from beginning of execution to completion differentiate? And starting to realize that there's not that significant of a difference if you use the same agentic harness and just swap out the underlying model across different problems. And I think it's not necessarily an emperor has no clothes situation where like, oh, there's not that big of a gap when you start doing agentic evals versus LLM evals. When you compare like frontier labs like Anthropic versus ChatGPT and Google obviously in that category. But the gap at least is not as big once you start using real work and you make it very tangible. So that for me, that's been an exciting thing that we've been working on. We're using the Harbor evaluation framework. We're using some tests that were defined within Benchmark. Both are awesome, by the way. Like I haven't used Harbor until like this last week, and it's an awesome framework to be able to run agentic evaluations, not just like LLM evaluations in a containerized environment. And that's been pretty cool to see. And I think it's only going to get more popular, like some of these evaluations of using an agent harness versus just the LLM, because then you start comparing actual work that's similar to what a person would be doing. And having that become more common ways that people start evaluating both the model, but also the agent framework that they're using.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I'm sure that a lot of people don't even know that you could use Claude Code with OpenAI models or Gemini models. Do you know how the cost kind of breaks out within the harness and the underlying LLM if you ask a question to Claude Code when it's using something like OpenAI? Like how much of the cost goes to the harness and how much gets attributed to the
I mean, nothing goes to the harness, right?
Oh,
Like
nothing?
it's all to your underlying subscription. The harness is just running locally. And so in just the harness, if you're using Claude Code versus using Open Code.
Like you're using 0 usage credits. If I use the harness of Claude Code, I'm essentially getting that for quote unquote free with the price of my subscription.
Yeah, you're downloading the code. Now, I haven't looked at all of the terms of service around if you use Claude Code with Kimi or using Claude Code with Quinn or Claude Code with DeepSeek or OpenAI, but it's an environment variable. You just you modify the environment variable, and then any API that speaks the language of the Anthropic API is it's configurable with Open Code. Now, most of the models that are served all conform to the Open API or the OpenAI spec. And so something like LLM Lite is a proxy service that you can run between your LLM provider that'll translate the LLM into OpenAI's spec, which was originally the standard. And so you can convert everything to ChatGPT-like interfaces. There's I think only DeepSeek natively supports the Claude or the Anthropic API spec. But if you want to be able to have everything translate from whatever the spec is of the service provider to OpenAI, what we ended up doing is using, I think it's a Claude Code proxy that sits on top of LLM Lite. And so that you can then you can host that proxy locally and then point any language model provider at the service for Claude Code and be able to run your Claude Code exactly as it exists right now, but with another language model provider, and then be able to compare like for like.
Interesting. And to your point earlier about using the same harness in different models and getting more or less the same result, like that isn't surprising to me at all. I feel like every time any of these model providers come out with announcements of new updates, the new model to me is turning into the least interesting update out of all of them. Because one, I feel like the models are getting better at a pace that's just a little bit slower than it was before. Like I remember when one of the Opus models came out, I think it was 4.5 or 4.6. It was just significantly better than the one before that. That's happening less frequently. And it's also a matter of even when one of these frontier model companies do make some kind of breakthrough, the other ones catch up very, very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And so
what gets me excited is tokens per second. So I hate the wall time, or the wall time when I'm just entering a prompt, waiting for Claude to come back with something or another language model provider. But when you switch over to using Cursor and Composer 2 or Composer 2.5, that just flies. And the tokens per second really start mattering, and you really appreciate that. And so with Cerebrus's IPO that was last week, they have a completely different chip architecture designed very specifically for inference, and then they can do speeds that are 10 times that of Anthropic. And so being able to start moving benchmarks in terms of speed, not necessarily in capabilities, that's where I notice it. That's something that you notice in real time. Oh wow, it ripped through all of that. It's taking a while because the local commands that I'm running on my machine, that's what's slowing it down. If it's writing Python code, it's how long it takes to execute that code, not how long it takes to send that to the model for inference and then tell me what to do next. So for me, that's a huge needle mover.
Yeah. Anthropic also came out with a lot of really interesting features around, honestly, their continued focus on making the developer experience better and making it easier for startups like us to build software for clients and for users using Anthropic's developer tools. And so we were just talking about that before we started filming, but why don't you kind of catch us up on the things that were most interesting for you?
Yeah, so for me, a couple, the self-hosted managed agent containers was really interesting. And so high level, the Claude managed agents allows you to be able to run a Claude code session within the Claude environment. And then it forces all of the data IO primarily to go through MCP. And so for firms that don't want to force data to go through MCP, and they don't want to expose all of the data within their environment to the cloud. They different firms have come, or different like hyperscalers will come out with more self-hosted managed agent frameworks. And so Claude rolled theirs out. It allows you to be able to host all of your tools and your data in your cloud. And so the tools that are being executed, and then just expose those tools over a queuing mechanism that the agent harness still runs within Anthropic, but it's calling out to the tools that are running locally. And essentially there's very little local compute happening. It's just inference and then determining what tool to call next. And then the tools that actually get executed, those run within a containerized environment in your cloud. So it's not a completely self-hosted agentic loop, but it is self-hosted agentic tools, which I think is pretty cool for enterprise adoption. I think one of the things that I've read into that a little bit is that Anthropic is not going after trying to capture spend from anything other than tokens. Like if you're AWS, or let's say you're Google, right? Like they want to get token spend for Gemini, but they also want your compute within GCP. And so when Gemini agent running an agent SDK or Spark, which I want you to kind of walk us through a little bit later, decides to write a query against a database, it might pick BigQuery, and then you pay per compute of BigQuery, and both the tokens and the compute within BigQuery all goes to Google. And so what Anthropic's making very clear, they don't care about anything that's built on top of their agentic loop and getting access to the revenue of that compute from the hyperscaler traditional cloud model. They just want compute. They just want tokens and they just want inference. And they'll run that loop in their environment, spend all the tokens that you want. The compute that's consumed, they could care less. Point it to whatever your environment is. They don't want to touch that, which for me is interesting, because I think that then it even gets to really you're just paying for tokens. And they have the best model for picking the next best token or the next best tool, and predicting the next best token better than anyone else. They're really doubling down, and they want to compete on token quality, and that's about it. With like them opening up the door for hosting your own sandbox for agents, but only allowing it for tools. They still want to manage the token consumption. So I thought that was cool.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would take it one step further and say that I think it seems like what they truly care about is getting the tokens of enterprises. Like I think so many of the features that they launched around agent memory management, right? You can now start building your own memory stores. You can now start creating these things called dreams, which essentially synthesize memories over the course of an agent's runtime and kind of condense them into almost like a synthesized version that reduces dupes or noise and creates this almost clean context that carries forward a lot of the important memories, decisions, mistakes that agent made. I think that's, to me, most applicable in the corporate setting, because you have these agents that are running across multiple users, multiple sessions, and one of the most important things for enterprises is to be able to create a sense of consistency and a sense of codifying domain knowledge or corporate knowledge about how that company operates within some kind of memory store as efficiently as possible without having to build it in-house. And so I think that the way that they're going about building on top of Claude Code, managed agent SDK, like it all seems very closely tethered with the problems and challenges that developers that are coding with Claude at work are experiencing, way more than, I guess, the average person that's trying to life hack their house or life hack their kind of personal calendar and things like that.
Yeah, and on the memory store, they're not forcing lock-in either, which I find refreshing, but it's interesting that they're
just a database.
Yeah, well, it's just text, right? Like it's just text that you can run within Git. There's skills. There's nothing proprietary about it. It's just text that you can run with the GitHub. And so if you want to create your own skill library, you can by pointing your GitHub repo at it. They're not creating any friction on top of being able to rip that skill library out and host it in a completely different model provider's environment. Same way with memories, if you're using Git as the primary storage for memories. And like dreaming is just running agents, reviewing all of your session usage history, removing dupes, like you said, identifying context that it should be able to pull from in the future, but storing these in these text formats so that if you wanted to, you would be able to like, all right, I want to move to ChatGPT, take your memory, take your skills, and swap out the underlying model without much overhead. And so there's not like using all of these things that they're building it makes the AI efficacy that much better, but there's not a vendor lock-in in the way that they could be approaching it if they were looking for something beyond just token consumption. Like maybe they're like trying to play a game like, oh, we want token consumption, and then we also want these other services on top of that, like your memory store, or we want token consumption, but we want to lock you in by keeping this in a proprietary format that you can't get access to. And by this, I mean like memory and skills, but they're not doing that. They're keeping those very open, and they're willing to compete just on token consumption as the primary mechanism of monetization of the offering, which I think is great. It's going to like it leads to a lot of experimentation of other ways that you can manage memory, other ways that you can define skills. But they're going to bat with their efficacy around their models, and then their ability for their models to predict the next best token. And if you want to build other tools or systems or infrastructure on top of that, have at it. We're not trying to keep that locked down, at least for right now. Now you do see a little bit of that in how they originally approached OpenClaw, where if you were using OpenClaw with OpenCode, they wouldn't allow you to use your Claude Code license, and that you had to pay on a per consumption basis. They kind of walked themselves back from that. But other than that, they've been pretty open. I think it's also interesting. I listen to All In podcasts like every week, and then there's always this meme that David Sachs has around, are they being monopolistic in terms of mitigating competition? And when I see them making open standards around skills and allowing you to swap your skills in to via GitHub, and then if you wanted to repurpose them for ChatGPT, taking memory stores and treating those as Git libraries that you could export and move somewhere else, I think it's awesome. Like how much of a lead they have, and they're not, from my perspective, abusing that in any way to make it difficult for one company to switch from Claude and go over to ChatGPT or their own open source combination of model providers, which is awesome for companies like us. Then we can confidently go into a client and say like, hey, like I think you can rock and roll with Claude. It's going to be a little bit pricier, but time to value is going to be quicker. Let's develop an awesome skill library. Let's develop some excellent organizational knowledge, expose that as a memory layer, make that available to Claude, use all of their distribution tools that they have, whether it's Claude Code for developers, Claude Cowork for your semi-technical analysts, PM. Let's use Claude Chat for people when they're on the go, and get value now. And then know that if you want to, you could take all of those like layers for skills, knowledge, agents, MCP, swap it out in 2 or 3 months from now, if the open source or the rest of the ecosystem catches up, without being concerned about lock-in right now. I just find it like pretty cool that they're competing in that kind of a way.
Yeah. And for listeners that haven't really used memory stores or aren't technical and don't really follow the developer day updates, all a memory store is a set of instructions for an agent about what is important and worth writing to this kind of database of text, right? So for example, you can build a memory store for an agent, and the instructions can be, anytime you make a mistake and I correct you and I explicitly ask you to do something different than what you did, write it down. And that's it. And then you can essentially mount or attach that agent to a specific session in the managed agent service, the API. And all the agent does is it does exactly what it normally does. It's just anytime it makes a mistake, it automatically writes a text file to that store. And then what dreams are is essentially every so often you could pass an entire memory store or a list of memories within a memory store into what is called a dream. And what Claude will do is it will read all of those memories, condense them into the most kind of optimal form of context, And that's your new memory store. That's the one that you use next time. And it kind of reminds me of what we were talking with Mitch about last week. I think the term was like recursive learning model, about agents and LLMs building and deciding what needs to stay in context. And that's, I think, the very beginning of exactly what this is. It's the agent. You need to make the decision of deciding what's worth writing to a store. You can have a store for past mistakes. You can have a store for best practices. You could have a store for risk formulas. You can be as specific or as generic as you want. And it's going to be really interesting to see how people use these stores and how we as a community start learning the best ways, similar to what we were doing when we were discovering how to build good MCP tools 2 years ago. But I really appreciate the elegance and the simplicity of what they've built. And again, the fact that it can translate and potentially be used across models, because it's just a bunch of text files. It's all it is.
And it's one advantage that they get also is that they do own a lot of the system prompts. So the way in which memory stores are exposed to Claude can be optimized for the memory store that they have. Because there are other memory tools like Layer 0, but those are primarily exposed over MCP. And is the MCP system prompt and context the ideal way for letting Claude know that it has these tools like memory to be able to inject in? It's going to be interesting to see how that evolves. But there's been other evolutions outside of Anthropic. Like I know that you were deep in the weeds on Google I/O, and they had some pretty awesome announcements. Like what all was included in that?
Yeah, so I don't keep up with what Google's working on a lot, but they had their I/O day, I want to say 2 days ago, a day ago, and it was making headlines, so I just kind of started reading about it. I think the general consensus was that there was almost too much in their announcements. Like they just had so many features and updates that I think the consensus is that they seem a little scatterbrained, or they seem like they're not really focusing on a specific demographic or a specific target the same way that Anthropic and OpenAI are. But I think that this is just the beginning of what consumer AI will be. I think that with OpenAI and Anthropic focusing a lot more on enterprise AI, I think what Google's doing is really interesting in that they're essentially just taking advantage of the very vast product ecosystem that they have, acknowledging the fact that a lot of people do use it for consumer needs, and building AI functionality around all of the things that we're already using all the time. And so I think there were 3 updates that I thought were the most interesting. One was their new Flash model, which is supposed to be a lot faster than other models, but still be comparable to like the Sonnets and Opuses and like GPT-5s of the world. Reviews on that were mixed. So we'll see if that actually gets better or if it stays as potentially mediocre as people are talking about it today are. The second was Spark, which is this new AI assistant that's embedded within all of your Google products, whether it's Gmail, whether it's Docs, whether it's Slides. And that's available to like their pro users or something. But the idea is that you have an agent that has access to all of those things at once, which could be really powerful if you use all of those things in your everyday life. And then the third one, which I thought was probably the most interesting and probably not as talked about, was their new Omni model, which is essentially setting out to build on top of what Nano Banana was, which was you put in text and you get out this really high quality image. Omni is kind of set out to be a model where you can input anything and then output anything, in terms of you could put in a video and ask for modifications of that video and it'll send you a new version of that video. You could, I don't know, put in audio and get out audio. You can essentially build a model that can take in different kinds of outputs, not just text, different kinds of inputs, not just text, and also produce any kind of output that you want. And so I think that their first version is somewhat constrained. I think that it only allows for outputs that are either audio or video. But the idea is that eventually it can expand to cover different kinds of inputs and outputs, which I think could be really interesting and could have applications for a lot of use cases and industries that the large language models don't necessarily work for. Like if you have a job that is a lot of video editing, like large language models probably aren't as useful for you as they are for a developer or companies like ours. So I thought that was really interesting. It's very it's really interesting to see how you compare kind of the dev days of all of these different models and all of these different companies, because I think that they say a lot about the things that they're prioritizing. Like when you look at Anthropic's dev day, very focused on agents, very focused on memory and state management, very focused on building on top of large enterprises with very complex workflows, while Google seems very focused on almost pioneering into what consumer AI looks like. What does it look like when you're using AI on your calendar or your maps or the things that you're using on your phone every single day? And I think that it makes sense that it's not completely cohesive, because I think that's a lot to expect with consumer AI right now. We just haven't made as much progress on it yet, but I think Google's the one that's doing it.
All right, so Jhanvi, before we go any further, I want to take a moment to hear from our sponsors.
I'm so excited to hear who our sponsors are.
I wonder who they could be.
Something that I hear pretty consistently from executive leaders in the space is that they see value in AI, but there's no clear path to actually adopting it. Most providers, whether it's the frontier models like Claude and OpenAI, or the platforms being built on top of them, they hand you a product and they leave you to figure out whether it works for your workflows and how. And at Hedgeneer, we take a very different approach.
And we're able to because we have industry experience to not just understand investment process in the abstract, but to know how a fund actually operates, where information is sourced, how it moves through a team, what synthesis happens before a decision gets made. Once we understand that, we can build custom connectors in a data platform that connects all your data directly into Claude or OpenAI. Bloomberg, your primes, your internal models, your internal research notes, whatever you're actually using.
And then we deploy our platform on top of that. Think of it as a command center that sits on top of your Claude or OpenAI account. You can see every agent at your disposal, both the personal ones that you've built for yourself, as well as the org-wide ones that are maintained by your company. You can ask them to do things on demand directly within the application, or you could schedule reoccurring tasks that have them running in the background and having them send you the results straight to you via Slack or email.
And we also track usage at the firm over time, so leadership can see where AI is working, where it isn't, and surface opportunities to go deeper.
And we run training sessions with your team on Claude, on the platform, and even how to prompt and build skills better. So the competency builds internally and it sticks over time.
So if you're interested in learning more about how we can help your fund become AI native, shoot us an email at info@hedgeneer.io.
So one of the things that I've been hearing more frequently in some of our sales calls and even conversations with our current clients is, as we're starting to build out a more elaborate tech stack around AI and we're starting to automate more things, like, is there a risk in really committing to a particular frontier model? Like, is there a risk in building everything around Anthropic or building everything around OpenAI? And what are the consequences of that as all of these models are kind of competing with each other and coming out with new things? And so I thought that would be a really interesting thing for us to kind of talk about on the podcast, because I'm sure that our clients are not the only people that are thinking about this.
Yeah, I had a candidate ask me that today and a client that we're just launching with. So it's very pertinent. And I think that if you understand what you're using the models for and you know what you're not using them for, it helps you be able to realize whether or not you have vendor locking, because I think that's what a lot of people are concerned on. And my answer is that the way that we build and deploy AI frameworks, we leverage the best models and ecosystem available with. Right now, it's primarily Anthropic. It's not just the models, it's also the ecosystem. But we do it in a way such that we're not dependent on them if we want to swap out the models in the future. So like a couple examples of that are, we heavily rely on a skill library. Each one of our clients, we develop a custom skill library for, but that skill library doesn't live inside Anthropic. It doesn't live inside ChatGPT. It lives inside our client's GitHub repo. And that is something that they own, travels with them. They can use those skills in any model provider that they decide to use, or within being an Omni model system where you could use any model depending upon the task at hand. And so the way that we deploy skill libraries, there's inherently no vendor lock-in. The second part is MCP servers. Like, again, to Anthropic's credit, like, they built the MCP spec originally, but then it's open sourced. It's an industry standard. And so if you're building your own MCP interfaces, there's no lock-in whether it's Anthropic or ChatGPT. So it's another big one. The observability layer, like that's what we spend a lot of time thinking about. It's if you listen to the most recent CISO interview for Anthropic, like he really pushes the importance of observability, and everything that they're doing around memory management and dreaming is built on top of out of the box observability that they have. I do think that one of the most valuable things that you should be doing to prevent long-term vendor lock-in is be able to own your own data as it pertains to the data you produce when you're using AI. And so if you can make sure, whether you're on ChatGPT Enterprise or on Claude Enterprise, that all of your data is flowing into a system that you own and manage and maintain, such that if you were to switch from one model provider to another, that all of that data is yours regardless of what model you use in the future. And that is the case with making sure that you set up the OTel, open telemetry, up front to retain that information. So if you swap out the actual model that you're using and use a different framework, that you still have all of that history data. Because the last thing that you want is to be in a situation where you've been using Claude, like Claude Enterprise for 2 years, and you have an entire wealth of data that you have collected and produced disappear when you switch over to ChatGPT Enterprise. And so in that regard, I feel as though even though everyone on our team is a Claude certified architect, I could go in and out of every minute feature that we have within Claude Code. And we do large scale trainings for some of the most sophisticated quant firms that are fully bought into Claude Code. Like they come to us and say like, hey, like we're using Claude at an expert level. Like, how do you help us get even better? And we're the team that they come to for that. So we know what we're talking about when it comes to the Claude ecosystem. But one of the things that you want to make sure that you don't get locked into is that the only ones that have your historical data. So if you want to be able to generate a knowledge store based off of historical session usage, then the only way that you have to be able to accomplish that is rely on their dreaming feature. I think that's when you start getting a little bit concerned about vendor locking, because you should be able to generate your own knowledge store and memories independent of having Claude do that for you, because you happen to have the data managed within your own cloud. You can still use their features because the UX is great, but you want to make sure that you have your own open telemetry system set up. And ideally, if you're using a ChatGPT Business and you're using Claude Enterprise, you have both of those flowing into the same OTel system, and you can then arbitrage both of them and be able to make intelligible decisions on which model is a little bit more effective for you. So long story short, the way that we deploy AI enterprise like software allows us to be model and vendor agnostic. However, we do encourage our clients to focus on getting value out of your AI first, and then worry about like how you manage spend and how you worry about being cross vendor agnostic second. Because if you're not even getting any ROI out of it in the first place, like worrying about vendor lock-in doesn't matter. And I think that was a mistake that I saw a lot of firms make early on when it came to cloud. Like they weren't on AWS, and they also weren't on GCP, and they weren't on Azure. And one of the reasons that they were concerned about choosing any of the three is like, oh, we don't want vendor lock-in. I was like, okay, well, if you don't want vendor lock-in, but you're not even using in the cloud in the first place, like wouldn't vendor lock-in and being really scalable with how you're managing your compute and not having infrastructure being a blocker for developers with vendor lock-in be better than having infrastructure that your developers can't even use in the first place? And so a lot of firms, I think, were slow to adopt cloud out of this concern around vendor lock-in, or they were trying to be cross-cloud too early, and that added unnecessary complexity when they weren't even getting the true value of cloud first. And so the firms that did, I think, the most successful initial engagements with cloud were ones that really knew the AWS feature set really well, or they just doubled down in understanding GCP, or they really understood Azure. And once they had a lot of success with cloud, then they focused on being cross-cloud. I think it's the same thing right now, where focus on like the model provider ecosystem that you're using and just get really good at that. And then once you have that, then it's going to be a little bit easier to switch from one of the two versus trying to figure out what is this common denominator substrate that we have to think really hard about so that we can switch model providers. But that's kind of adding this additional layer of complexity that makes it harder for us to get value out of AI in the first place. I see right now, after going through a couple of transitions from model provider to model provider, that's not as hard of a problem. And what is hard is figuring out how you get culture, organizational adoption, best practices scaled, and making sure that you get the ROI of AI first before you worry about vendor lock-in as a main priority.
Yeah. It's like that meme with the bell curve. All the way on the left of the bell curve, it's people that aren't really using AI for anything super sophisticated, but they're still worried about vendor lock-in, kind of similar like the cloud analogy. Then in the middle, it's, all right, I'm going to start building some kind of tech stack for my company around AI. I'm automating things in a more systematic way. I'm thinking more about state management, context management, et cetera. Great, just working off of one model. And then all the way on the right side of the bell curve, you've built this really nice stack. Your firm is using AI in these really interesting and meaningful ways. Now you're worried about vendor lock-in again. And it's actually justified. And I think we interact more with the latter scenario. But I think the question is, I think you're right in that the validity of the question really depends on where you're at in your AI journey as a company. And I also think it's interesting because I think the nuance to this question varies versus, it varies when you're thinking about building a backend system that your company, like a backbone to your company and the APIs and workflows that are happening in the background and that being model agnostic and not locked in versus people that are using these interfaces like Cowork or Claude Code or Codex or ChatGPT and trying to figure out whether it makes sense to have some questions go to Claude and some questions go to ChatGPT. And to that, I always say the answer is no. Like from a non-technical user perspective, I think that there is so much value and that value is only increasing in having all of your memories and context living in one ecosystem. Like Anthropic just came out with this feature on Cowork where you can actually start a new session and ask it to search through your past sessions. And I think that's incredibly powerful if you're living and breathing and doing everything that you do in Cowork. It becomes significantly less powerful if half of the context of what you're doing on a day-to-day is sitting in ChatGPT. And so we work with clients that have multiple of those licenses. And I think the first question that we ask when we start working with them is why? Explain to us why that is. And I think that your point around the cost of switching getting lower and lower in terms of effort, like I don't think that's an accident. I think that's intentional. Like as products and competitors solidify, people make it really easy to switch. Like if you were to sign up for, let's say, Rippling as your PEO, and then you wanted to switch over to Deal makes it very, very easy to switch because it is in their best interest to make it easy. Same thing with Claude. They allow you to import memories from ChatGPT if you ever want to switch. And I think that that is going to continue becoming a theme as companies really start kind of planting a stake in some kind of AI strategy implementation, and it starts becoming a more and more consequential part of their business. Having a salesperson call from the competitor frontier model and being like, I can make it so easy for you to switch. I think it's going to be what these deployment companies end up doing at some point as well. It's not going to be just about, we'll help your company adopt AI. It's going to be, hey, we're the AI deployment company. We can help you switch from Claude in a seamless way. And this is how much you could potentially save on compute.
And that's the future.
That's the future.
Yeah. So with that, everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. Again, I'm your host, Michael Watson.
And I'm Jhanvi Virani.
And we want to thank you for tuning in. You can follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram. We're on Twitter, TikTok, but always subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts.
And you can email us now at podcast@hedgenear.io if you ever want to reach out to us and chat.
Until next time, take it easy.
The Hedgenear podcast releases episodes weekly on Tuesday. Our hosts are Michael Watson and Jhanvi Virani. The Hedgenear podcast is produced and edited by Aaron Free. Follow us on your social platform of choice and reach out to us at podcast@hedgenear.io.